Go ahead, Karen.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the SWAMP webinar on the regional water quality monitoring in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'll be talking today about San Francisco Bay regional monitoring, and I'll first be giving you an overview of regional water quality monitoring, and then I'll be talking about regional swamp monitoring. I'll be talking about enlarging the swamp umbrella within the region through swamp comparability, and then I'll be talking about half the presentation on the San Francisco Estuary RMP. This is our region, the outline of our region. It's approximately the size of Connecticut with twice the population. Population is centered around these cities, San Francisco, San Jose, and Oakland. We get runoff from about 40% of the land mass of California through the Delta here. In 1993, we set up the San Francisco Estuary Regional Monitoring Program, so that was the first regional monitoring program in the San Francisco Bay Area. Then we started to sample fish for fish contamination through the Coastal Fish Monitoring Program. We started this in 1998. We also sampled fish from 10 reservoirs in the region for contaminants through the Toxic Substance Monitoring Program, and both the Coastal Fish and Toxic Substance Monitoring Program were rolled in to the SWAMP program. Then in 2001, we started measuring watershed, evaluating watersheds, monitoring and assessing the health of the watersheds through SWAMP. This was our first year of monitoring. And then this was our second year, and 2003, 2004, 2005, and 2006. This last year went over to 2006. By this time, we realized that with diminishing resources, and we spent a lot of time gaining access and getting permission for these sites, that the best idea would be to collaborate with our stormwater programs so that we could monitor sites collaboratively with them. So I'll get into that later in the presentation. And so in 2006, we were still monitoring. In 2007, we spent writing reports and developing a new study design, and then in 2008, we started our new studies. Now I'll go more into the that I just mentioned. From 1998 to 2002, we conducted several studies on sampling fish for contaminants. We did this at 10 reservoirs in the region: Tomales Bay, the San Mateo Coast, the San Francisco Coast, and the Islands. This was the data from the reservoir study. You can see we have high levels of mercury. This is the key over here, particularly in the South Bay, but we had elevated levels of mercury throughout the reservoirs in the Bay Area. As soon as I saw this data, I put together a committee. This is the PCB concentrations. You can see here that Lake Chabot is really high in PCBs. And this was verified by subsequent studies as well as the swamp bog study. So as soon as this data came out, I put together a fish contamination committee, and that included the Department of Health Services, as well as the WEHA, county health departments, and responsible parties. This was very beneficial to bring these parties in from the very beginning. We coordinated for about 6 months. We evaluated the data together. WEHA and the county health departments helped to develop fish advisories. The committee got together to develop signs and fact sheets. We translated these into 5 different languages. We put out a joint press release. We now have ongoing education and outreach, and all 10 of those reservoirs are on the 303D list. The coastal results showed that, they resulted in an WEHA fish consumption advisory for Tomales Bay based on elevated mercury. We spent a lot of time sampling commercially grown oysters, mussels, and clams because there's a thriving aquaculture industry out in Tomales Bay, and we found that levels of methylmercury in these shellfish were low, and so the advisory doesn't apply to them. We also found some contamination around the San Mateo coast, but the good news was that salmon composites had no screening value exceedances. Then, as I said, in 2001, we started our monitoring in watersheds. Our objectives were to evaluate spatial and temporal trends, to identify reference sites, to identify impaired water bodies that would end up on the 303D list, to determine if impacts are associated with specific land uses, to develop and evaluate monitoring tools, to develop assessment tools, to use standard sampling protocols, SWAMP QAPP and SWAMP base to provide statewide consistency and availability of data. So our sampling design used several tiers. For our first tier, we would go out in spring and we would conduct benthic macroinvertebrate bioassessments as well as physical habitat assessments, and we would measure basic water quality parameters during that process. The Tier 2 was a subset of those stations. We would sample during 3 hydrologic regimes, during wet season, the declining hydrograph in spring, as well as dry season sampling. These were all sampling for water, for chemical analysis, for toxicity using the EPA 3 species tests. For nutrients, we put out YSI SONs for continuous measurement of temperature, DO, pH, and we developed a rapid trash assessment method to evaluate trash within these watersheds. We also had an integrator site at the bottom of each watershed where we measured sediment sample chemistry and toxicity, and we also put out bags of clams that we were going to measure for bioaccumulation, and we did that the first year, but everybody kept taking our clams, so we finally discontinued that in the second year. We also measured E. coli at sites with water contact recreation. Our general results were that water quality problems in streams related to elevated temperature, low DO, elevated nutrients, and poor physical habitat. The nutrients were highest in urban creeks. The contaminants were low. This was an ambient water monitoring program, so we didn't monitor stormwater, but in ambient water, the contaminant levels were low and the sediment levels were low relative to objectives and guidelines. Diazinon toxicity was declining in the urban creeks over this period, but pyrethroid toxicity that was associated with the sediment was increasing. The most important indicators for the ambient monitoring we found to be bioassessment and associated PHAB, continuous monitoring with temperature, DO, and pH, nutrient monitoring, and toxicity monitoring in urban, industrial, or agricultural areas. The benthic macroinvertebrate assemblages grouped into 3 land use categories, with open space and rural residential land use having the most healthy communities, then ag grazing, and then urban areas having the most impacted benthic community assemblages. We found high levels of trash in all the urban watersheds we monitored, with the highest levels at the bottom of watersheds, and the trash was mostly associated with parks, schools, and fast food restaurants. And we came to the conclusion after these studies that we needed a reference site study to find out what's the best that we can attain in this region, both in urban areas and more areas with kind of open space land use and not land uses that would impact the streams. This is an example of some of the results we got in one of our watersheds, Stevens Permanente. This is for temperature, DO, and pH. And you can see here, this is the urban boundary. And up here, we had fairly good water quality, even though it started to be impacted even high in the watershed. But as we got further and further into the urban area, particularly farther down where these creeks go into the bay, you can see we had very high temperatures and low dissolved oxygen and high changes in pH. This is also reflected in the not sure what to do here. In the bioassessment results. You can see that above the urban boundary, we had fairly good benthic healthy benthic communities, but as we came down below the urban boundary, we had very impacted unhealthy benthic communities. And this is based on cumulative taxa richness and percent sensitive EPT. So we decided that we not only needed reference sites that were in areas with limited land use as far as ag and urban and industrial, but we also needed some urban reference sites. During that study, we were in Chileno Creek in Marin County. Right upstream from this area, there's very heavy cattle grazing. This is Walker 130. The Gales, who are private ranch owners, decided to do a restoration project in the creek, and we happened to be monitoring in that creek. So we monitored benthic macroinvertebrates and evaluated cumulative taxa richness as well as sensitive EPT, and found that the benthic community really responded to this restoration project, and fairly quickly also. You can see that not only did they respond at the restoration site, but below the restoration site. Swamp monitoring has resulted in 50 303D listings or proposed listings in the region. 26 of these listings were trashed, and they were based on the swamp revised rapid trash assessment method. We revised this method to evaluate photographs that people submitted on trash in creeks, and 11 of these listings were based on swamp data. We also had listings based on temperature, pyrethroids, water toxicity, selenium, sediment toxicity, DO, and we had a series of listings based on fish contamination results. So in 2007, we wrote 3 reports, and we also put together our new study designs and started our next series of monitoring in 2008. The first thing we did was to do a reference site study. We identified reference sites to describe and track reference conditions. We wanted to track long-term and seasonal trends. We wanted to use these sites for IBI development, and we have a regional group called BambiNet, Bay Area Macro Benthic Invertebrate Network, and we all collaborate. We're trying to collaborate on a Bay Area IBI to see if we can use the North Coast or South Coast IBI, or whether Bay Area specific IBI is Index of Biological Integrity is needed. We also wanted to choose some urban reference sites, which are the best attainable areas that we could find, to see what impacts urban land use had and what is the best attainable that we can expect. We wanted to develop better assessment tools, particularly for nutrients. We don't really have any good nutrient criteria to use, and so we developed this design so that we would have nutrient concentrations. We also collected algae using the algae bioassessment protocol, chlorophyll A. We conducted PHAB. We also had continuous monitoring of DO and temperature, so we'd actually be able to evaluate the effects of nutrients in order to develop or contribute to the development of nutrient thresholds. We worked on algae protocols, and we conducted algae surveys seasonally. We also developed the FlexiGrid. Revital Katz-Nelson, one of our contractors, developed this method where we use a tablet with a touchstone screen. This is like an Excel spreadsheet where we can record the results of physical habitat assessments. We can then come right back to the office and download that data, as well as calculating metrics, and we're now working on a crosswalk where we'll be able to download this data directly into the SWAMP database. In the future, we want to develop a watershed monitoring coalition with our stormwater dischargers, and that's what we'll be working on in this coming year. The second type of studies we're doing is to develop information for OEHA, Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, fish consumption advisories. And these are follow-up to the swamp statewide study that was conducted by the BOG, as well as the studies that we have done previously. We have enough information on those creeks to know they might be or they are impaired, and yet we don't have enough information for fish consumption advisories. So we're developing that information for lakes in a year. We also have gotten involved in a Suisun Bay Study. There are concerns that concentrations of ammonia in Suisun Bay are inhibiting phytoplankton growth, and this might be affecting the food chain and contributing to the pelagic organism decline. So this study is oriented towards exploring the relationships between ammonia and phytoplankton in Suisun Bay, as well as trying to identify sources of ammonia. Our reference site study design, we selected 6 reference sites based on previous data from the places, from sites we've been through the 5 years. We wanted reference sites from different ecoregions. We wanted perennial and intermittent creeks and large and small creeks. We wanted 2 urban creeks, our best attainable along a gradient, where we have 3 sites in each of the 2 urban creeks along a gradient around the urban boundary. Our indicators are, and frequency, we measure benthic macroinvertebrates. We sample for benthic macroinvertebrates in PHAB once a year during May, which is our index period. We sample for algae in PHAB 3 times a year in May, June, and August to try to find out what the best index period might be for this region. We measure nutrients 6 times a year, and these are all overlapping, so we can look at nutrient data in coordination with the algae, PHAB, and BMI. And then we deploy continuous monitoring sondes from May to September, so we have continuous monitoring data for DO, temperature, pH, and conductivity. These are our reference sites. They're spread out throughout the region. Ritchie Creek, Redwood Creek, and Pescadero are perennial creeks, whereas Coyote Creek, Indian Creek, and Mount Diablo are intermittent. Our 2 urban sites are Las Trampas and Saratoga. We're now in the process of evaluating that data and writing up reports, and we should have a report available next winter. Now I'll go into the fish studies that we are conducting currently. This is the BOG data from the swamp statewide study on fish contamination. This is the data from San Francisco Bay. You can see this is mercury in largemouth bass. This is the key down here. You can see all these red dots. They're very high levels of mercury. There were very few, only 1 lake in our region that had lower levels of mercury. So we're following up in coordination with the WEHA to sample 4 lakes a year for advisory information so that they can develop advisories for all our lakes. These are the PCB concentrations. You can see we also had some lakes with very high concentrations of PCBs. In the Suisun Bay Study, we're going out once a week over a 12-week period from March to June and sampling 7 stations. There's some evidence that the ammonium that might be impacting phytoplankton in Suisun Bay is coming down from the Sacramento River. We also have some plants within this area, some sewage treatment plants, as well as some ag runoff. So we're sampling nutrients, chlorophyll A, and we're taking an algae sample for taxonomic analysis once a week at each one of these 7 stations. And then we'll be evaluating that data this fall. These are the reports we've written. Chemical concentrations in fish. We have 3 reports evaluating our watershed data. We have a rapid trash report on our rapid trash assessment method and results, and then the integrated report, the 5B and 303D. Within the region, we've tried to enlarge the swamp umbrella through swamp comparability. So we've asked anybody if they need help within the region being swamp comparable and told them that we'll give you a hand. So we've done some internal swamp training. We did a 2009 algae training. Then we also conducted a 2-hour brown bag for Region 2 staff describing the swamp program, some of the data we've collected, as well as how they become swamp comparable. We're just right now developing a lab contract with requirements for swamp comparability, and once the state board starts rolling out the requirement for swamp comparability of other programs, we'll be having division meetings with those programs to help them become swamp comparable. The San Francisco Estuary Regional Monitoring Program is swamp comparable, and they have contributed to the bog study. We also just put out a municipal regional stormwater permit this fall, and it requires swamp comparability for status and trends monitoring in the watersheds. It builds on the swamp design that we developed regionally, and it encouraged the Watershed Monitoring Coalition. We envision that SWAMP will monitor reference sites and bottom of the watershed sites where we'll measure long-term sediment toxicity and chemistry, and the stormwater programs will monitor the urban creeks. Now I'll talk about the regional monitoring program that has been active in our region since 1993 and is administered by the San Francisco Estuary Institute. In 1986, the San Francisco Bay Regional Board approved a basin plan with toxic pollutant standards. Based on the Clean Water Act, and by 1987, the water treatment plants in the area spent $1.2 billion on infrastructure upgrades. However, we had almost no data to judge whether these management actions were effective in meeting these water quality standards. So our executive officer put out a Section 13267 letter based on Clean Water Act requests to require the NPDES dischargers in the region to monitor water quality in San Francisco Bay to see if we're meeting these standards. So this was a stick. We also had a carrot. We told them that we would reduce required receiving water monitoring if they got together in a collaborative to do a regional program. In the first year, we had 48 permit holders participate in the program. We've developed a method to allocate fees through various programs that participate. The dredging program for cooling water, it's PG&E, stormwater, industrial dischargers, and municipal dischargers. The regional board issues the permits, and then we have a memorandum of understanding with SFEI for fees. And our total budget in 2009 was $3.9 million. We have, this is our structure, we have a steering committee and a technical review committee with these agencies that are part of that committee. The governance structure provides feedback between high-quality science and agency viewpoints. Here below the technical review committee, we have 4 work groups: sources, pathways, and loadings, contaminant fate, exposure and effects, and emerging contaminants. And this information goes both up and down when we get information from studies conducted by these groups that mostly contract out the studies that we sponsor. We also have 6 strategies. We found out that work on, for instance, the Mercury or PCB TMDL crossed over several of these work groups, and we wanted to have a cohesive strategy for addressing TMDL needs and for implementing requirements in the TMDLs. So we set up 6 strategies: Mercury, PCBs, dioxins, settling, air deposition, and small tributary loading. And these strategies feed up into the work groups as well as the technical review committee and steering committee. We have one goal: collect data and communicate information about water quality in the San Francisco estuary to support management decisions, but several management questions. The first question is, are chemical concentrations in the estuary at levels of concern, and are associated impacts likely? The second is, what are concentrations and masses of contaminants? The third one is, what are the sources, pathways, and loadings and processes leading to contaminant-related impacts? The fourth is more trend-related. Have the concentrations, masses, or impacts increased or decreased? And then the fifth is, what are the projected concentrations of masses and associated impacts? And we use a lot of modeling to see what management actions, what effect management actions might have on projected concentrations and masses. Well, how does the RMP answer the management questions? We have two types of programs. One is status and trends monitoring that started in 1993, and we also have a pilot and special studies component of the program. In the status and trends program, we monitor sediment and water annually. We monitor bivalves every 2 years, sport fish every 3 years, and bird eggs every 3 years. The pilot and special studies provide a framework for adaptive management, and they're responsible to the changing needs of water quality management. These are the components of the status and trends program. We monitor water and sediment. In the beginning of the program, we had a targeted approach where we had targeted sites down the spine of the estuary. What we do now is we have a probabilistic approach where we measure water chemistry annually in the summertime. This approach is a stratified random design, so we stratify within various sections of the bay, the rivers, Suisun Bay, San Pablo Bay, Central Bay, South Bay, and Lower South Bay, and these are the number of we have for water or chemistry, water or sediment. We not only have random sites for the sediment, but we also have some historical fixed stations. So for the water, we just measure chemistry. We measure toxicity early on, and this generated into an episodic toxicity program where we measured runoff toxicity. But right now, we're measuring water column toxicity every 5 years, but water chemistry annually. We evaluate sediment toxicity, chemistry, and benthos according to the sediment quality objectives method. We measure, evaluate, and sample sediment annually, and we alternate between summer and winter sampling. These are some of our monitoring results. This is for BDE 209 and sediment, but our results look fairly similar from contaminants, for various contaminants, in the sense that we usually have higher levels of contaminants in the lower South Bay. We have a lot of flushing that comes down the river. The water goes down these rivers through the San Pablo Bay and out the Golden Gate. So this area gets a lot of flushing. The South Bay acts more like a lagoon, so there's not as much flushing. And in addition, there's very high population centers in the South Bay with San Jose, Silicon Valley, and the second largest mercury mine in the world was also located in the South Bay. We conduct status and trends, bivalve monitoring similar to mussel watch, where we deploy mussels at these green stations. They're targeted stations. But we also sample corbicula in these freshwater stations in the Sacramento and San Joaquin. We have 11 historical sites, and we analyze these tissues for organics and inorganics. We also contract out to USGS to collect samples throughout the bay. They collect water samples at 36 sites monthly where they measure nutrients, chlorophyll A, and basic water quality parameters. We also have deployed 5 sites optical back scanners for continuous suspended sediment concentration. We found out from these studies that concentrations of suspended sediment are declining in the bay. This is significant because we thought that the thing that was controlling primary production was turbidity in the bay. The bay is very turbid and shallow. The average depth is about 15 feet. But the bay seems to be becoming, having more light transmittance and less suspended sediment. This, we've also found through this study that there's higher amount of phytoplankton production, particularly in the fall. So this has been a very valuable program. We also sample bird eggs every 3 years. We measure cormorant. We sample cormorant eggs because they're better for trend monitoring of average conditions in the bay. They have a larger range and larger prey. We analyze these eggs for mercury, selenium, PBDEs, PCBs, pesticides, and emerging contaminants. Our Forster's terns in the bay have the highest concentrations of mercury of any of the species that we study. We found that the terns are better for effects-oriented monitoring. They have a high exposure and they live in shallow habitats. There's a TMDL target for mercury based on tern eggs, and when we sample those eggs, we analyze mercury, selenium, and PBDEs. The other component of status and trends monitoring is sport fish monitoring, and we conduct this monitoring to inform management actions, both TMDLs and fish consumption advisories. We measure PCBs, PBDEs, PAHs, dioxin, selenium, mercury, and emerging contaminants in sport fish. We have emerging contaminant work group, and they've been very active in developing lists of emerging contaminants for us to measure in some of the higher trophic levels like sport fish and bird eggs. You can see from this graph that mercury concentrations in our two highest species, leopard shark and striped bass, are really not declining. We also have part of the status and trends component is tributary monitoring. This is changing our understanding of loads to the bay. We have loading, we measure loading from the Sacramento River, the Guadalupe River, as well as small urban creeks. And then we model that information, and it's become very important for TMDL to determine what are the inputs to, that are contributing to the concentrations of mercury and masses of mercury in the bay, as well as the modeling helps us determine what management actions might have an effect. This information is for our PCB model, and you can see that in 2002 we felt that, well, we thought that large rivers were the major contributor to PCBs in the bay, contributing 54% of the PCBs. And then after the monitoring and modeling, we now think that the large rivers only contribute about 21%, but the in-bay erosion contributes 27%, and that wasn't really much on our radar in 2002. In addition, we found that small tributaries are contributing a higher percentage of 47%. Our models are very valuable in evaluating the effects of management actions. So we can project through these models into the future what concentrations or loads might be based on future projections. We have a foodweb model for the PCB TMDL. We have a multi-box mass budget model. And we're now developing a watershed or bay margins model in the South Bay, and we're also developing foodweb models to incorporate with this watershed and bay margins model. I talked about our strategies. We have a strategy for mercury, dioxin, PCBs, modeling, small tributary loading, and air deposition. I'll just give you an example of our mercury strategy. We have annual status and trends monitoring for mercury in the sediment, water, fish, and in birds, but we also have special and pilot studies. These studies are small fish. We have an isotope study and a DGT study. The mercury strategy has two basic questions. The key questions are, where is mercury entering the food web, and which processes, sources, and pathways contributed disproportionately to the food web accumulation? This is particularly important in this estuary because we're now conducting the largest wetland restoration project west of the Mississippi, And we know that there's a lot of methylmercury bioaccumulation from marshes. So we're turning salt ponds into tidal marshes in the South Bay. So in order to answer the question, where is mercury entering the food chain, we monitor small fish to evaluate sources and processes. The sources are mines, POTWs, and urban runoff. These small fish are also a good spatial indicator of mercury exposure and uptake, and a good temporal indicator because they accumulate over just a one-year time frame. And we have a TMDL target that's based on small fish. You can see these high concentrations in the South Bay. We also issued an RFP to answer the questions on processes, sources, and pathways. We have a mercury isotope contract with the University of Michigan that's hoping to use mercury isotopes as a potential fingerprint for sources. We also have a contract with Trent University for diffusive gradient thin films. They're all similar to semi-permeable membranes, but for methylmercury uptake. We also have pilot studies for mercury in bird eggs. USGS is our contractor for these studies. We found that, as I said, Forster's terns have the highest concentrations of mercury of any birds that we studied in the bay. We found that fail-to-hatch eggs are associated with mercury concentrations, and the higher the mercury concentration, the decreased hatching success. We now have a current TMDL target of 0.5 ppm, and the studies that USGS has done on mercury concentrations and in Forster's terns and their associated effects has found that 0.5 ppm, which is our target, would be protective. However, the challenge now is reaching that target because you can see that mercury in the bird eggs are much higher than that. We also have pilot studies on effects of PAHs on juvenile flatfish. NOAA is our contractor for that study, and the study is to determine potential endpoints and effects of higher molecular weight PAHs on developing flatfish and sediment. It's a 2-year study. The first year is a modeling work with model fish. It's actually experimental work with model fish. And the second year is we apply the first year results to Bay Area fish and environmental sediment samples from the Bay. The RMP structure allows for adaptive management. We have a changing regulatory focus where we have an increased focus on biota in our TMDLs. We have targets for fish and birds, and the RMP started with just sampling water and sediment, and we've moved increasingly towards monitoring biota. In addition, there's been a greater concern about chemicals of emerging concern, pharmaceutical products, and we've been measuring these chemicals in the water column sediment, and now we're coordinating with NOAA and with SWRCB on a large-scale project. There's many different ways of disseminating information for the RMP. We have the Pulse of the Estuary, technical reports, journal articles, RMP annual meeting, workshops on selected topics, and they have a wonderful website where you can query the data. This year, the Pulse of the Estuary is going to be on watersheds, and swamp monitoring will be one of their featured articles. This is some of the way you can have data displayed from the website output. And this is their website where you can obtain data and reports. And that's it. I'd like to thank my swamp crew, Carissa Anderson, series of bioassessment coordinators, Matt Cover, Carrie Ann Lopez, and David Williams, Peter Otis, our contractor, Revital Katz-Nelson, as well as Jay Davis and Meg Sedlak, who manage the RMP and the RMP participants. Okay, thank you. Hello? Are there any questions? John, are there any questions?
Okay, it looks like the mute should be off now, so you should be able to ask your questions. If you have trouble, use the chat feature.
Hello?
Hello?
Hello. I was just trying to see what was going on.
I know. We're all just hanging up.
Hi, Karen.
Hi, Karen. That was great. Great job.
It was great. I was trying to tell you that, but I think I was muted.
I
did too. And I felt so sad.
Are there any questions?
I have one question. This is Letitia Valadez from Region 5.
Uh-huh.
The question is, all the mercury numbers that you put out, are they, and all the modeling, are they the methyl mercury number or are they a total mercury number?
Which numbers were you talking about?
Any of them, like when you said 0.5 was most protective for that species.
Oh, for bird eggs? Yeah, that's a, I believe it's a total mercury number.
That was just my question.
Karen, I've got
I believe,
one.
though, that most of the mercury in bird eggs is methyl mercury.
So do you do your modeling for methyl mercury or do you do it for total mercury?
We've been doing it for total mercury.
Karen, I've got a question that came in via the chat.
Uh-huh.
The comment is that the person was surprised to see atmospheric deposition so low for mercury. Do you want to comment on that?
We have a new atmospheric deposition work group that's evaluating atmospheric deposition, and we're cognizant of the fact that in most other areas of the world, atmospheric deposition is a major source. However, because of all the mining that's taken place in this area, we have the second largest mercury mine in the world in the South Bay. Many, many mercury mines, and a lot of this mercury was brought up to the Sierra for amalgamating gold and then has come down with the flow of the water down back to the bay. That is one of a major source. I mean, it's possible that some of the small tributary sources are based on atmospheric deposition. We're trying to evaluate that. In the bog study that's coming out, the study on fish contamination in the state at lakes, there's a discussion of atmospheric deposition and mining to see whether mercury, what the sources might be of mercury contamination to the fish in the lakes throughout the state. There's also a lot of geologic deposits in the state. They're really high in mercury, so it's really hard to tease these two sources out. But There probably is some input from atmospheric deposition, but we don't think that it's as high as some of the other sources.
Another question that's come in through the chat, can you expand on the thinking behind the splitting monitoring with swamp monitoring at reference sites and bottoms of creeks and having stormwater programs monitor urban creek sites?
Well, as part of our stormwater permit, the stormwater programs are being required to measure loads as well as measuring the status and trends of water quality in the urban creeks. We've had a lot of trouble getting access to a lot of the creeks. We spend probably half of our time trying to get access and permissions for many of the sampling sites we had during the first 5 years. We had almost 300 sampling sites, and it took us a lot of work to get access, permission for access. The stormwater programs don't really have that problem, and they're responsible for those urban waterways. So as in most of the stormwater permits that have been written, the monitoring is incorporated into that permit. We want to form a coalition and with them and contribute to that monitoring by monitoring reference sites. We also have, I've coordinated the statewide swamp monitoring program of bottom of watershed sites where we measure sediment chemistry and toxicity to coordinate with the sites that we want the stormwater programs to monitor. So SWAMP will take that responsibility from them, so that'll alleviate them from some of the cost of the program.
Other questions?
Oh. Karen, this is Jeannie.
Yeah?
I have a question for you. When you were talking about your reference site monitoring for swamp, you mentioned that you were sampling from May to September. So is anyone or anything being collected at the reference sites during the actual stormwater season?
Well, we do. We have been sampling nutrients in December and February. We don't usually go out during storms. We just don't usually sample stormwater for swamp, but we have sampled during the wet season. Even in those 5 years of watershed monitoring, we usually conducted our wet weather monitoring in February. So it was during wet weather, but it wasn't within 24 hours of a storm.
Karen?
Yeah?
Yeah, this is Syed Ali with the State Water Board.
Hey.
Thank you for excellent presentation. I'm interested in the synthetic pyrethroids. You mentioned that there are new listings. I don't know how many, but you had like one example there. And you also talked about a work group. Is this the same like the Registrants Pyrethroid Working Group, PWG, or is there something different that you have at the region?
I mostly talked about the work groups in association with the Regional Monitoring Program. I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Well, there's another work group here. We call it PWG, Pyrethroid Working Group, but it's mainly the registrants, of the pyrethroid, synthetic pyrethroids, who are complying with the re-evaluation requirements.
Yeah, we don't have a pesticide work group per se. We have a, I put down the main work groups, but actually we have more work groups. We have a toxicity work group. We have a causes of sediment toxicity work group. We have a benthos work group. And in the toxicity work group, we work a lot with toxicity caused by, contaminants. And we have, right now we're working more on causes of sediment toxicity, but that might incorporate pyrethroids. So that's the main, I would think, work group where we would be addressing pyrethroids. That's kind of a subset of the effects work group.
Okay. How many new listings you have for synthetic pyrethroids?
It went well.
I would have to go back and look.
Well, you know, I ran the first part of the session, and then Rick put up and did the last part.
Those of you who are not asking a question, would you please mute your phone?
It didn't have an excuse or didn't contact us, so that's discouraging. But you know.
Any other questions?
Well, Kirker Creek we have listed for pyrethroids. That's the main one we have listed now.
Okay. Thank you, Karen.
Mm-hmm.
And this is based on sediment toxicity or sediment?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Anybody else? Syed, the reason I think is that we didn't start measuring pyrethroids until the last year of the study because they just didn't have, pyrethroid methods down in that till later in that time period around 2005, 2006. So
Karen, in the future you'll probably expand pyrethroid monitoring both in sediment and water column?
Well, we do monitor. We are requiring monitor through the stormwater permit, and we also include pyrethroids in the spot part of the program where we analyze sediment at the bottom of watersheds throughout the state.
Great.
And as well as, doing toxicity analysis.
Great. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, well, hearing none, I want to thank you all for participating. Thank you very much, Karen, for a great presentation.
Thank you.